Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's healthcare discussion about risk transformation and enterprise risk management. Just some logistics. We are recording this program, so if you could submit your questions or your comments via the chat, that'd be great. You are able to earn one CPE credit for this live session. To earn that, you need to answer 3 polling questions at various intervals through this call, as well as and participate through the duration of the webcast. You'll get your CPE certificates within two weeks via email. And there will be also a survey forwarded to you after this webcast. So with that said, I'd like to turn it right over to Todd, Gower, and Augustine, who are going to be facilitating today's presentation. They're going to introduce themselves, and then they're going to go ahead and get started. Todd?
Thank you, Ken, and nice to meet everybody virtually here today. So Augie and I, we both have our experience in healthcare for a number of years, and as well as especially on risk and managing risk, either in a leadership capacity from a controller, finance, or security, a leader, or what have you. But I think the main point here for us is to give you an overview of enterprise risk management and risk transformation, how the two work together. Thank you. Next page. So the key takeaways from today's presentation that we'll be going over, we'll be looking at the ERM do's and don'ts. And we also make sure this is interactive as well. So if you do have questions, please make sure to put them in the chat. What is risk transformation? You may hear this from some other firms or other professionals, what this all means, specifically in the payer provider or life sciences space. And looking at a management roadmap to help with your risk management, enterprise risk management, or governance risk and compliance, however you want to frame it, but looking at a roadmap for that and looking at how to sustain it. It's one of the big things we found, both Augie and I have seen, is like sustainability. Great to bring in somebody in to assess your risk management maturity, looking how it's being managed, but then how you sustain it to make sure that you've got proper controls and oversight in place for proper risk management. And then staffing needs to support proactive risk management. Okay. So we'll do a little acronym game. In the healthcare space, many of you are probably with a healthcare company or organization or new to healthcare, getting in from the industry. Our industry is laden with a lot of different acronyms. This is just a small sample of those that you may hear, maybe throughout the presentation or with other colleagues. The main things to think about is that the shorten as much as you can, especially if you work with the alphabets. They definitely like to shorten everything down to a few letters, like CMS, DEA, DOJ, OIG, and the like. Love to shorten everything down to 3 to 4 letters, as you can see here. But the most important thing is, what do you think of when you look at some of these acronyms or what they relate to? This is just a helpful list for you to think about when you think about when you say 340B program, there's a lot more to unpack in that sort of acronym, but there's a lot behind it, specifically around the federal registers that support the 340B program, along with anything else like the Code of Federal Regulations, is basically the Bible, if you will, for us in the healthcare compliance space. And as you know, down here for HRSA, HIPAA, HAC, all the H's that are there, all related to health. It's amazing how that can be sometimes misinterpreted, or if it's missaid, like hack, HACK, different from HAC. So there's a number of things to think about. And also, which is fun to see sometimes, is HIPAA with double P versus double A. You'll see that once in a while. But again, just a fun use of the words, the acronyms, if you will, which will lead us into I think the next slide of a polling question to get things started here. Make it easy.
First polling question, everybody. What does CMS stand for? Okay. Oh, wait, I don't know why it's not showing. Sorry.
Oh, for the poll.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sorry. Can you see the screen? Great, thank you. What does CMS stand for? Center for Medicare and Medicaid, Center for Central Medicaid Medical Services, and Clinical Management Systems. Great. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully that was simple, right?
Great. And it's okay to think, because actually all three can be correct in a way, but what we're looking at for CMS, how it gets used commonly, is our Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That's the basically the nation's largest health plan, quite frankly, managing all the health insurance activities for the nation, for Medicare and Medicaid. And why is that important? Because a lot of the regulation and oversight from CMS, if you do decide to take, or you're working with an organization that takes federal dollars for Medicare, Medicaid, many plans, and the like, that's a regulatory body overseeing what's being done and managed for those systems. Okay. Thank you, Kenan, for that. So let's give a little executive summary of why the need for risk transformation in ERM. Well, the main piece on this, it's a hot topic. I mean, if you think about the risk factors that went into place following the announcement of COVID and the variations of COVID, the variants that existed, along with all the other side effects that have taken place, managing risk has been a big thing. How to mitigate that as much as possible. Wearing a mask, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad, but the feedback has been it's a good way to mitigate risk if you're traveling. Right. So risk management from your daily lives to professional lives is really key. And this has been a hot topic, especially when everyone has either been having to work from home, or work in a hospital setting, or health plan setting, or life sciences, medical devices, or pill compounding. All of those facilities all have to have some sort of interaction, either machines or people. But with that, there's mitigation of risk in the overall day-to-day activities. And thinking about this, there's strategic ways to look at it. You can't put 100% veil or protection or bubble around everything. You have to assume some risk. And I know my good friend Augie will go into a little later on ERM about assuming risk acceptance. That's a big component to this, because you can identify all the risks all day long, but how do you manage them? How do you mitigate them? And how do you provide some oversight so that if it does happen, how do you react? And I think in this case, when we think about what CMS, as I mentioned earlier, looks at for enforcement and fines, mitigating those risks to make sure people, one, the most important thing is do no harm to your members and patients and individuals. But secondly, following the rules in order to engage, to receive Fed state funds, mitigating the risk of being called out for enforcement or fine actions or clawbacks. The work they used to do with CMS and the RAC program and MSP was one of those things we were known for, clawing back from the providers for inappropriate or procedures that are not medically necessary, from the deeming of the rules and regulations of that procedure diagnoses. And so when you think about when you work with the Fed, there are these actions that take place that say, you've repeatedly ignored our statements of potential corrective actions, observations, and receiving a corrective action, and you continue to ignore it. Aside from clawbacks would be what it's called the CIA, not the Central Intelligence Agency, but a corporate integrity agreement, which basically can slow you down from growth or shut you down sooner or later if you don't react appropriately, along with any DOJ indictments, and in some cases up to jail time. So again, how to mitigate all those extremes, it's all spelled out in the CFRs, but there are ways around making sure how do you get to know about all that information without going stir crazy of trying to find a dashboard for every single reg. It's almost impossible, but there are ways around it to kind of look at those things and mitigate the risk and accept some of the risk. All right, that's what we'll be talking about today.
Todd, could you share or Augie, both of you,
Yeah.
breaking out payer, provider, and life sciences? Just curious, like what are the top one or two things that maybe that are being the focus areas in each one of these each one of these pillars of payer, provider, and life sciences?
Yeah, and there's a slide here in a little bit. We'll kind of go into that a little bit. You're right. But just think about that out loud. When we think about payers, the health plans, right? So risk mitigation about inappropriate conversations with potential members or current members not getting their appeal and grievances turned around correctly, or on time, ignoring those appeals and grievances, along with providers not being available, accessible to those members is one thing to think about. So saying a health plan has X providers in their network doesn't exist really, or they just tapped out. They can't, there's risk around that. Same with providers and nurses or healthcare professionals, HCPs, another funny acronym, but HCPs, healthcare professionals that that may not act appropriately are some risks, or they're not available or overcharged, or just a number of things that can happen. In the life sciences space, there's a number of things that can happen regarding to poor compounding, devices not working, giving claims and marketing that's inappropriate or not clearly stated, or it doesn't follow the FDA guidelines. There's a number of things and risks to think about in the life sciences space that most of us see, but to realize there's a lot of oversight needed for that. So, but yeah, I'll pause there. Let Augie comment if you like.
Yeah, that more recently, there are a lot of focus on ESG and environmental, social, and governance.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
that's also front and center. Or in pretty much all healthcare companies are talking about it, figuring out how to really incorporate that as part of their risk management going forward.
Thank you, Augie.
Sure.
Right. Does that help, Kenan?
Yep, thank you.
You're welcome. So let's define what is ERM and operational risk. And that's a great segue. Thank you, Kenan, for that. Because if we try to define it openly, it could be a long discussion. And we're told we only have a little bit of time here, but our goal here is just to kind of give you some insights into ERM, or refresh your memory, or if you're getting into space and reminding yourselves the importance of it, and or getting you charged up, like, you know what, I want to be a risk professional. To think about that. This is the fun stuff we think about. Is that uncertainty, right, that impacts the organization? Is it pervasive? Is it a chronic problem that goes in and slows down the business growth? It's not about having a gotcha exercise or a checklist to think about risk management. It's like, how do you look at the organization? When I think about startups and what kind of risks they manage, as far as raising funds or managing the business, to have enough cash to burn, will the hospital, health plan, or life science company have enough cash to maintain its servicing of patients and members, and device development, R&D? All those things are consideration in enterprise risk management. It's not just following the list of checklists from the CMS or the Fed, FDA, or the whole alphabet soup. That's that. And when you think about operational risk, the uncertainty into delivering, and that's where you think about call outs that happen. A crash cart doesn't get done, and logistics in a hospital system. Like, I have friends that work in the space. And you think about someone calls out sick. Well, there's an OR activity going on, and the crash carts aren't ready, or the prep for the facility isn't ready, or if the insurance plan hasn't been properly vetted out, and of course the vendors that are supporting the health plan for that particular member don't have those services. All those things that aren't in play, those contracts aren't in play, could all break down. Or in the case of supply chain, operational risk for life sciences, compounding to getting ingredients to materials to make medical devices, all those things in consideration are all big components for that. Right. And go to the next.
Actually, Todd, a quick question. Talk
Yes,
to
sir.
me a little bit about monitoring these things, like your crash. Is that Joint Commission that comes does that? And in regards to life sciences, who's the monitoring agency for the supply chain things that you were talking about? What, like, how does that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. You think about supply chain, you got FDA, you got make sure those vendors are certified. So regardless of what industry you're in the healthcare space, making sure you're buying goods and services or supplies for that organization that do not have any sort of provision against them or covenants against them that doesn't allow you to buy from them. In this case, if some of those companies do buy from them, you're being watched anyway. So there's exclusions, either providers or vendors, they have to be looked at from all the commissions. They'll be looking at this, always a provisional review on any sort of exclusionary activities that are being done by an individual supplier or provider or whomever it may be. But all the all the commissions, all the regulators, state and Fed, all look at those sort of exclusion activities to be watched out for. I think, and when you think about monitoring too, I think the big thing around that is that sort of that first, second, third line defense. And we look at risk in that space. You have your operational risk space, which is looking at their operations itself. What are those things you're supposed to be looking at to make sure the organization is watching for that? So that education from the second and third line defense, which we'll talk here secondly, of compliance, external audit, the internal audit as well, along with the board, gives you guidance as far as regulators, gives you guidance for the operations to make sure they operate effectively within the guidelines. That second line defense of compliance, the organization, regulatory oversight or delegation oversight groups will look at that operation to make sure they're operating within the boundaries, which is important. And that third line defense is like, you know what, first line's got to be doing it on a daily 15-second basis, or every second, every minute, every hour basis. Compliance is looking at it on a monthly, quarterly basis, annual basis. Internal audit, third line defense, external audit looks at it on the annual, quarterly, or by direction of a committee, depending if it's the management committee, leadership committee, or the board, to see whether or not, based on a risk assessment of the organization from ERM, says, you know what, these areas need to be monitored on a very close basis, annually, repeatedly, regardless, to be looked at. So monitoring is a term of art. Is it meaning monitoring by turnaround times, accuracy, and completeness, or is it monitoring effectiveness of controls, making sure everyone understands it? So monitoring from a definition standpoint has a wide span. Hope that helps. So let's look at a few questions. These are okay. Good. Okay, cool. Very good. Do's and don'ts. This is kind of fun that Augie and I look at this quite often. We talk to our clients, so sometimes we'll parlay our efforts from risk management to ERM to audit activities and compliance, internal audit. But things that we definitely see out there on looking at risk management, and these are across the other industries too. So what you need to do when you think about risk management and ERM, you should identify, assess, and mitigate. Don't only take a reactive approach or no approach at all. Augie, how many times have you seen this where you would go in and say, great, we've assessed it, but being reactive isn't the path, but there are other paths to take, right? I don't know if you want to comment on some of these things. This is my experiential, keeping it simple for folks. Some of this is like duh factor, but helpful in a way if you communicate with your leadership about how to help you out and set up a ERM or risk management team. I don't know, Augie, if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I would like to comment a little bit. Well, a few number of times you see companies, identify the risk, and because of maybe how the consultant presented the risk, it's too complex for them to take any actionable steps, and therefore they just shy away from it, or they get the summary of it, of what the enterprise risk management process involves, and they don't get back to you or the company at all, because it looks very burdensome. So here it's really important for us talked about, for it to be simple process. Complexity is not needed. Things need to be identified really simply, and it should be clear how things are being identified, whether it's for the board level identification, an executive level identification, or whether it's to help the business to really manage the rest. So that distinction really helps put everybody at ease, and the expectations are much clearer. It's really, like Todd said, it's really very, very important to have something, start the process, be in the process of identifying the risk and taking steps to manage some aspects of the risk, than to do a no-show at all.
Thank you, Augie. I think one of the key points too that we find, he and I can go in, or our teams can go in and look at an organization and what RGP does, just so we do our data out from project management risk to execution risk, or just oversight and support risk in interim roles, is the thing we find, and 9 times out of 10 is around risk ownership and accountability to that risk. Great to identify it, put it on a risk register. The management sees it from leadership up to the board level. When we present to the board on a quarterly or monthly basis, depending on the structure of the organization, is that risk owner. They own the risk statement, they own the mitigation activities, and making sure being held accountable for that. A lot of times you're seeing a risk register is being created or has been created, it sits there, and it may be by definition the department of where the risk sits, but not one person or one group is actually being held accountable to mitigate it. Maybe on paper, but there's not an active activity that we're seeing in the space. Hence why the need for transforming the thought process and activities to look at risk in a way that is active, not passive. And that's where we're trying to get to, and we're seeing a lot of our customers get there. It's not a flip on a switch and it happens overnight. This is a transformational activity that takes cultural change sometimes, management change sometimes, process and technology change sometimes. So it is a transformational activity to be active in the risk management space.
And I want to add a little bit about what Todd said, which is really very important when it comes to the risk owners. You know, a number of times you've seen that we have all these nicely developed risk register, and the risk owner was never involved in the development of the
That's right.
of the risk register.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden everybody is saying, hey, you got to implement this, and he or she goes, well, I don't even know what you're talking about that you want me to implement. It's really critical to engage the risk owners and have them help you develop the risk register, because then they can take ownership of every aspect of that risk register and be able to execute and stay engaged on it. Don't thrust it on them. And, you know, thrusting it on them only leads to disengagement, or they don't have a buy into whatever you're saying on that risk register. It's really, really critical. And Todd did mention this. That is a very, very important aspect of the whole engagement process of making sure they're executing what's in the risk register.
Thank you, Augie.
Yeah.
You're right. On the last one, I'll put a point on this for this slide. For everyone thinking about this, there's always the easy aspect of looking at the problem, identifying it, putting it on paper, a chart or a book, and there's a thud factor that happens. Like, look what I found. That's great. However, how you manage it later on, and how does that book never really changes. It may expand. The big thing is about accountability and accepting a risk or what you're doing to mitigate against it. The one thing you can't forget is, like, it's not just a one report deal. It is a constant evolving process that where I'm in with this one client right now, who have been phenomenal partners in the space, that we have been transforming the entire risk program for about 2.5 years now. We're getting common language, common understanding, the follow-up process versus, yeah, we finished our mitigation and correct activities. What happens next? Well, I'm giving you a call next month. How you doing? So it's that constant proactive activity that once you put it in place, it may seem very onerous at first. It is very onerous. But as you put it in place, it's a small step here and there, and just monitoring and checking in. As Ken asked earlier, what does monitoring look like? It looks at the severity of the risk, looks at the size of the organization and risk of the organization, prioritization or of the organization to make risk make a priority. So I'll pause there. Want to go to the next slide? Now, risk transformation. We kind of given you a little bit of a teaser talking about risks, a little bit defining risk, first, second, third line defense. But what does risk transformation all encompass? A lot of words on the page. A lot of there's probably more, or you could span on each one of these things all by themselves. That take a lot of time. But for the most part, we try to summarize this in 4 or 5 different areas that people hear about and may see about this, and you can Google it if you will too. That it's interesting to think about what does this all encompass around risk transformation. Examples to consider, as I try to put on this page. So risk maturity, we talked about it earlier, maturing the risk from zero, which is basic ad hoc, to being well-established, leading edge. How do you get there? One, it's how much money you have to get there. Do you have the right technology, right people and processes in place? Think about that. Effectiveness of your compliance program. That's second line defense. First line, very important. Hire the right people, have right process and desktop procedures in place to make sure that the operation is running effectively. But second line defense of compliance, making sure that interaction between enforcement activities along with those regulators is clearly there, that you can interact with them to make sure that any changes that come down the pike, that there is a good coordination with the organization. Is it an IT function? Is it a leadership function? Is it a process function needs to change based on changes in regulation? And out of program effectiveness, meaning that effectiveness of dealing with the onslaught that happens to an organization, be it payer, provider, or life sciences, that you're constantly getting a cue from a regulator or an operating body that's going to be testing you. It could be your vendors as well that are auditing you, making sure you're operating effectively with the controls that should be in place against the regulations.
Todd, let me add a little bit to that audit program effectiveness. It's so important that, for instance, it can be as simple as just looking at your risk register for this year and next year and comparing how the risk have moved on that risk register, so that you get an understanding of what is actually effective for you. What are the things you're doing that is actually working in managing the risk? I'll pass, and Todd, take it from there.
No, I think it's a valid point. It's like checking your engine light, right? You know you're going to the gas station every week. Hey, you check your engine light. All the lights on your system, your car are all working. I know I can go to the airport or go see wherever I need to go to for a meeting, or go see your mom or grandma, what have you. It's Mother's Day weekend, right? Make sure you go see your mom or call your mom. Those things, you know you're going to get the questions. Are you going to make it there on time? Now you have to stop. All those things you have to think about in preparing for your organization to move, contract. If you're downsizing, you're doing an acquisition activity. All those things, as Augustine made, if you have a good risk profile of your organization and risk register, you know how each of those things, all those triggers are operating, so you can make those decisions. That's all it's about, decision support services to be an effective organization. So the importance of this slide here is to kind of give you an insight of like what does risk transformation mean. It could mean not all of them may apply to you, but for the most part, this is what we're seeing. Augie and I look at these organizations, looking at maturity, vendor management, third-party risk, delivery of the organization risk, what you have in place for the second, third line defense to operate and support you, and what sort of reporting technology you have available to make sure you can monitor that dashboard, if you will, for program effectiveness and risk management. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can unpack all this down a little deeper if you can, but what's risk transformation maturity? There are a lot of models out there for maturity ratings, but what we find is looking at how do you balance the organization, making sure you've got good risk management, good operational risks, the oversight. The thing is, do you have the right things in place to manage that risk? And trigger actions that can take place in some cases, like you're a new manager coming on board, new executives come on board or leaving. We're dealing with this right now with a couple of my clients that's going through this process of CEO change, big deal, culture change. Will that person still want to evolve the compliance or oversight committees more so than they did in the past, or they want to shrink it? All those things could take place. How long does it typically take to kind of do a maturity assessment? If you go bring a third party in to help with this, it could take 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the size and complexity of the organization. So just thinking through maturity, it's not a one-day exercise. It's really assessing and making sure, but there are a lot of tools out there to help you with that process. Next page. Next slide, sorry. Thank you. So we touched on this earlier from Augie. Thank you very much, sir. You're right. Getting a program effectiveness and readiness, it's all all those elements of looking at the organization's leadership. Do you have the right leaders in place to make sure your program is being effective, and there's enough support from that from a maturity standpoint. But that program effectiveness ready for the onslaught that can happen from a readiness audit that can take place is really key. So that second and third line defense effectiveness is really key. Making sure there's a good culture, good tone at the top, that operation is operating in a collaborative way, not just sitting in a silo. We found a lot of cases where compliance officers or internal audit executives or risk officers sit there waiting for things to happen. All they do is maybe conflicts of interest, do compliance training, but not really going after what risks are there. So being proactive and making sure you have an effective program and testing the organization's effectiveness to manage against risk. Again, the time frame to look at this sort of effectiveness, if you're looking at budgeting this sort of thing, activity, or even if you are a CAE or CCO, what will it take to kind of look at effectiveness internally to do a checklist for yourself? It could take some time to develop that. So this gives you some ideas around that. All right. Next.
Just had a quick question, and by the way, we're at the bottom of the hour, 32 minutes in. I'm curious, with this languaging around impending recession and economic concerns, if from an enterprise risk management point of view, if there's things that you've heard or things that all of these industries, payer, provider, life sciences, need to be considering right now with this possibility, or if we're in a current recession, about economic issues.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, exactly. So there are different schools of thought of the economics. Increasing supply helps reduce pricing because you got more supply out there. So how do you develop more, right? Or there's a contraction where you can't get credit, can't expand anyway. So the cost of goods and services go up because of restriction of supply. Economics discussion, it depends what sort of theories you practice or believe in, but there is a downturn, recession, where people are not buying goods and services. So a lot of companies have do more with less is a problem. The other thing about this too, looking at your program, managing risk of economics is always got to be on the risk register. Again, I look at this all the time where you go, it's great. All these things are being tracked and assessed, but how are your financial risk? What is that going on? How can you support this program or support risk management? What other risks to consider in a downturn, a recession, economic forecast? It could be some headwinds. What do you have to do? Look at cash burn. That's a big deal to think about, and it does impact risk acceptance.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm thinking that the treasury function is probably an area that needs to be looked at as specifically, as well as, I mean, yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, the treasury function is probably doing all it's doing in regards to being diligent about those kind of topics. But from a risk and compliance point of view, there's probably some procedures that probably should be.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you look at risk management from, I do support on some startups, that cash burn is a big deal, and it's just that they're in the medical device companies that exist. And so they're having to buy supply that's taken a while to get there. So that means they can't reach their customers soon enough. So customers will drop maybe because they don't want to wait that long. So all those things take into consideration because of the economic forecast that's going on, some headwinds. All those things have to be consideration other than just your normal compliance regulatory response. It's the overall business risk functions. When we think about this space, it's not just regulatory risk and an compliance checklist, it's everything involved in the organization to make sure it functions to be strategic in supporting that organization. Thanks, Ken. That's a great question. Third-party risk management. Yeah, one of the first things to look at, how can I cut my spend? Look at my vendors, cut it by 10%. The spend, great. Okay, that's one way to help reduce risk spend. But also, are those the right vendors for you? In the case of payers, are your vendors supporting your members right? Or are the contracts with the providers or health systems adequate? And do they have right access and the right people? On the hospital side, it's all about supply chain and making sure you got the right tools in place to support the hospital, especially in setting up ER, OR activities, or just admitting activities for inpatient, outpatient, and any sort of provider clinical setting. supply chain is a big deal, especially in the life sciences space on building compounding activities. But looking at this, what are some of the trigger things to consider is that economic downturn, as well as regulatory requirements to make sure you have a proactive program in place to monitor your vendors to make sure you don't have any excluded suppliers, providers, or individuals working at your facility to violate those covenants, to make sure you don't have those in place. This is a one that gets missed a lot on third party. I think it's being done by procurement. No, it's not just a procurement. That's first line defense. Second, third line means compliance, internal audit or external auditors. Third party people come in and assess this activity is really key. So it should not be missed. All right. Next. Great. Polling question. Kenan.
Question.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay, see the screen? Great. Who helps in third-party risk management? IT, compliance, operations, all of the above. Great.
Fantastic. And you know what? Depending on the organization you're in, either one of these, but typically all of them are helping in that space. Because as I mentioned earlier, in order to have an effective risk management program, which my dear friend Augie is going to go into, but ERM, it's a collaboration. It's a working together that a lot of compliance officers and chief audit executives have challenges with and can have challenges with is that collaboration with operational leaders to make sure, do you have all the controls in place? I think I do as operator, but you know what? Let's have an objective third party come in to help support that. You know what? I have my vendor set up. You know what? The language in my contract, the BA language is out of date. I didn't know that. Crap. All right. So legal can't be held accountable to that. Operation has to be accountable, but so does compliance. So it's not just one person, it's a collaborative effort when you look at risk management, especially on third parties. Thank you, Kenan. Go to the next slide. So, well, we've been talking about, do I still need to consider transforming risk management program to be more proactive? The answer is yes. So, that was a little slow in the take. Sorry about that, guys. It just happens. But anyway, that the answer is yes, and I think it's expected to think about what does the cost of being proactive mean. The cost of ignoring it and not being proactive is probably greater than being proactive. And also, just like you do personally with your own lives, your retirement, your day-to-day financials, being proactive and making sure, just the same thing you do in your professional careers, working with your companies, health plans providers, or life science companies, being proactive on risk management is key. Again, at the end of the day, in healthcare, do no harm. Period in the story. Whether it's a patient, a member going through clinical trials, and even receiving that sort of service delivery from whatever model of care, mode of care, do no harm is really key. So mitigating their risk of doing harm, regardless of regulation, is critical. So I will end with my section, I think, on this.
Hey, Todd.
No, what?
Real quick, Stephen, I've unmuted you. You have a question?
Yes, Stephen. Oh.
Stephen is still on mute.
Okay. As you look at your risk, I mean, besides looking at some of the qualitative things with your vendors, do you also look at besides looking at the quantitative, you look at the qualitative, like, does the vendor values match ours? Do they make a good partner with us? Because their brand can influence our brand and executing and so.
Steve, that's awesome. You think about, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There's some vendors, as I know this from working in other countries and working across different aisles and in different industries in some cases, that vendor relationship is truly key. And right now, especially during this crazy time we have, the pandemic, who can you trust? And having the same values and partner with you is critical. As I mentioned earlier on a few startups, and especially in the direct-to-consumer market, the branding piece is critical. And who your suppliers helping you and tying down to you, yes. So I think from that standpoint, when we look at cultural risk, that on the third-party side, there is a qualitative component that we put into our space. We look at, are those the right vendors? And you have to risk profile, especially if you got 1,000 different vendors, and profiling that may be the only vendor that supplies you that. So you have to look and see how that. But why'd you choose them in the first place? Are there substitutes? If they don't align, maybe great providers in price, decent product, but you know what? Their social their social consciousness is not aligned to your company and can have a backlash on your overall brand. That is something to consider. Absolutely. Be it a provider in the healthcare space, a doctor or nurse or healthcare professional doing something wrong or having certain views that's counter to the organization. Those things to consider are also part of that. I think HR and other organizations now have social media considerations for the employees. It's downstream to your vendors as well to some degree. Not so much social media, it could be other things they involve themselves in, but may not be aligned to your organization. So great question. Great question, Stephen.
Well, you are who you align yourself with or surround yourself with.
But that's right. You're absolutely right. And having done this, and both I and I have done this in other countries too, and it's a big deal. You know, you find yourself aligned to something and you're wrong, it can backfire on you. So
Todd and Stephen, thank you for that question. I just actually want to plug in here that just even as us as a company, we actually see a lot of vendor rationalization going on right now in general. And I know part of it is, okay, from a cost perspective, et cetera. But I think this whole idea of risk, and especially around the ESG conversation, there's a lot of companies not doubling down, but really pressing into this whole topic about mitigating risk from a vendor point of view.
And you know, and that's a good point. And I'll switch over to my dear friend Augie. But I think the ESG piece, and while you're touching on this, it's actually forcing a dialogue. Initially, everyone thought it was like, okay, everyone's being overly sensitive to this. But when you think about it, the social consciousness of an organization, once it's purpose driven, and it's not aligning itself to its vendors and third parties, it's going to take time. It's going to force those organizations that want to do business with them to be in line the same way. We're seeing it as Ken mentioned, as our firm is doing, maybe a little expensive, but at the end of the day, the long game is a better thing to have the right partner in place. Thank you, Kenan.
Yeah, just a time check. 15 minutes left.
Yes, sir. I'm gonna give it over to my right honorable friend. So.
Well, Todd, thank you for providing really good details and insights about how to really pull a program together. Now, what most people may be familiar with now is Silicon Valley Bank. They are not in the healthcare, but let's use them as an example of really why strategic risk management is really important for any company. When you look at Silicon Valley, they did all the right things in terms of compliance, operations, but forgot about one key thing, one of their really material big risk, that was not managed. And right now they are not in business anymore. So the slide you're looking at really depicts what goes on when you don't take care of your big risk. Right now, what we see out there is, and companies are beginning to, move away from really just going about their compliance business to really focusing on their strategic risk. Because the majority of the failures of companies, or be it healthcare, any industry, really comes from their inability to manage their strategic risk. Right now, they're spending only about 6% of their efforts in managing strategic risk. Now, to what Todd talked about earlier on, the operating, the compliance, they are really very important risks. If you don't have those, you may not even be allowed to operate. Now, if you are able to operate, what else can really wreck your company? It's those strategic risks. If you don't really get your arms around your big material risk for the company, or while you may be compliant all day long, you have the right vendors and everything else, you may wake up one day and not have a business because one of your big risks just happened and you weren't prepared for it. So let's move to the next slide, please.
Polling question number 3. In the past decade, what type of risk caused organizations the most loss in market value? Financial reporting risks, operating risks, strategic risks, legal and compliance risks. It's a good question. There's a toss-up between 2 right now.
Yep.
Yeah.
As expected.
Because you can have the strategy, but you must execute.
Yes.
That's right. I love it.
So looking at this is good in terms of the dialogue that we're having. The focus more is going to be on the strategic risk. And I know a lot of companies struggle with how to define strategic risk. Legal and compliance risk for a lot of the healthcare companies has been huge because it can lead to you being open or not open for business at all if you're not compliant. Now, the strategic risks come to head when you can actually be running the business model to the ground, where you're taking in $1 and spending $5, and therefore your ability to continue as a going company is not sustainable. So what we usually see out there now is companies are beginning to get really smart about how to manage risk as a whole. And that's why strategic enterprise risk management has become a really big deal for. When you go to the next slide, please. Now, when you
Augie, before you go on, in strategic risk, typically you find that most companies do like a 5-year type cycle and so on. Do you find with the current economics and just the world, the way it moves at a faster pace, that you should probably be doing strategic risk more often than a 5-year range?
Oh, Stephen, that's an excellent question. One of the things that we recommend and what we've observed is that depending on your industry, if you're in technology industry, you probably want to do your strategic risk management every year, because at the end of 12 months, things have changed considerably in technology. Now, if you're in healthcare, you can go as long as 3 years or 2 to 3 years to really do your strategic risk and still be on point. Now, if you're in other industries, you could go even 4 years, but really the focus will be what industry you are in. If we're talking about healthcare today, what we highly recommend is that you take a look at your risk at least every 2 years, because at the end of 2 years, with the economy we have, things are beginning to change more rapidly in healthcare. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So when we look at strategic risk, there are a number of core benefits that companies experience by really taking a look at risk from the standpoint of their strategic objectives and goals. That's what strategic risk management is all about. It takes it to a different level, where the board and the executives are saying, okay, here are the set of goals and objectives we want to achieve this year, and here's how we're going to do them, and here are the risks that will prevent us or really slow us down from achieving these goals and objectives. So then we go about really mapping out those risks and knowing when they occur and how to manage them. Now, if you're able to do that effectively, you are able to experience some of these benefits we have listed out there, where you are able to actually achieve your strategic goals. That's the first and I think the most important part of the strategic risk management, because it helps you navigate those challenges that could otherwise prevent you from achieving your goals. So you get the benefit of achieving your goals. Another which we think is really, we've seen out there, is it gets management to be very efficient and effective because they really understand what's going on in their business environment. And so the decisions that they make are really, they get a lot better traction than some, a company that doesn't have that strategic risk management in place. And frankly, the third part is just the direct result of all the good things you're doing in strategic risk management. You perform better, and also financially, you begin to get a lot more traction with, achieving your targeted goals. And, fourth part is it just becomes natural, because as you understand the big things that could derail your progress, you begin to also understand what are the regulatory things that are big enough that you need to really make sure you manage. And if you're managing those, you are able to achieve all your regulatory compliance requirements. And as you go through the strategic process and talking to IT and talking to everybody in the company, what are the key things that you need to even realize your strategies? Well, IT becomes a huge component of that, because that's the medium within which all these things happen. So you begin to strengthen your IT better, because you begin to prioritize IT spend and give them the resources that they need to be able to have the environment that's going to support the achievement of your goals. So at the high level, when you put together a strategic risk management program, you really elevate the entire company on those key items that you need to execute on to achieve your goals. And that's what strategic enterprise risk management is all about. Now, move to the next slide, please.
Last polling question, everybody. In the past decade, what % of time did organizations spend on managing strategic risks? 6, 13, 39, 42. %.
Well, it turns out how many? Well, they spend 6%. So this explains why we struggle with strategic risk management, because companies see it as something they do later on, as opposed to something which will be front and center of risk management. And by moving strategic risk management to a level where is managed more often than other risks, all of a sudden it changes the picture and allows the company to be able to manage those big ticket items, the high stakes items that could really derail the company's ability to achieve its goals. Next slide, please. So what is it about strategic risk management that's makes it so vital to achieving your goals?
Hey,
Well,
Augie and Todd, real quick, 5-minute warning, just so you know, till the top of the hour.
Sure. So because of the shortness of time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint a broad picture of what really strategic risk management involves. The first part is to really understand what your business objectives and goals are. Every risk needs to be looked at within the lens of your goals and your objectives. That's the core of strategic risk management. Now, what we see out there, most people starting to do is, first, they do some type of risk, maturity assessment to compare how the organization is, managing its risk as compared to COSO, ISO, and others, and get a good sense of how mature your program is. And then we see next, when people complete that, they go to now assessing the enterprise-wide risk. And the focus right now is enterprise-wide risk, not just the risks that reside in individual departments. And then thirdly, we see companies, once they do that enterprise risk assessment, they put together some risk governance tools and the risk oversight tools. And then next, they don't forget about the business, because the business is the makeup of your company. So they go back and say, okay, let's look at the risk within the business units and assess those. And then I create dashboards or tools to govern risk at the business level. Now, once they've done that, then they move to modeling the risk, and then using the insights they learn from the modeled risk to really refine some of the reporting that they're doing on the risk. And lastly, they try to integrate risk, enterprise, into strategic planning. So those are some of the steps we've seen out there companies go. Now, you don't have to do this in 1 year. You can do this over 10 years, very piecemeal, based on what budget you have. And majority of the time, you don't even have to go into details. You can do a little bit of it at a time, and cumulatively, you'll see this will add tremendous value to your overall business. Next slide, please.
Well, we have 3 minutes left, so you guys, if you do have questions, here, this is probably the best place to go, is to reach out to partner@rgphealthcare.com. We do want to be mindful of your time. So thank you so much for today. As I mentioned, you will be getting a survey, and as well as CPE if you have signed in on the CPE. We thank you very much for your time, and we wish you all a great week. Thank you.
Just one last thing.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, if people want to get a hold of us, we are on LinkedIn. So just as a way to think about, but thank you, Ken. This has been a great, informative webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.